There was a German Jewish community in New London from around 1854 to perhaps 1896. And only 2 or 3 families of that German Jewish community stayed in New London. Most of them moved away and they moved to Boston. And from what I could learn, the reason they left is there simply wasn't a large enough community for their children to meet other Jews. And to give you an idea of how the German Jewish community was really very integrated into New London, they didn't open their own cemetery. There's a Jewish section in Cedar Grove Cemetery, fenced in, but it's all Jewish graves. And then in the late 1890s, the Jews began to arrive in New London from Russia with the big wave of immigration after the pogroms.
When the Jews began to leave Europe, we're talking in this case primarily about the Pale, Russia, Poland, in that region, this way they got into the country, the Goldene Medina, the Golden Land. And the only problem was they didn't have very much money. How are they going to afford to buy a ticket? And when they got here, where were they going to live and how are they going to earn a living? A very well-to-do, matter of fact, one of the wealthiest men in Europe, a fellow by the name of Baron Maurice de Hirsch, who was a Jewish man who'd done very well in business, railroads, very big in railroads. Matter of fact, he's the guy who started the Orient Express. He underwrote people to come in. He bought their tickets. He helped them when they got here to purchase farms, and he found the areas. He had agents who went out and found the areas. He worked with HIAS, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and with them would help settle people in different communities. Chesterfield, Connecticut was one, Colchester was another, Vernon, Rockville, Connecticut. What was the connection between Chesterfield and New London? Well, Chesterfield was a little, sort of a hamlet within the town of Montville, but it didn't have the things that the big city, like New London, big city, 12,000 people, maybe 14 in those days. But what New London did have that Montville didn't have, Chesterfield was part of the town of Montville, so it didn't have a high school. But for these kids to have high school, it meant New London. So right away, there's a connection. Also, all of the business they were doing, they were attracting, be it hats or any of the other stuff, or buggy whips. The Kaplan family made buggy whips. All of those things meant they had to have the connection through New London. My grandmother came over, she married a man, they wound up in Chesterfield, and her children are the generation that moved out.
My great-grandparents, Alexander and Sarah Hendel, lived in a small village which we call a shtetl called Pustov. It's now in Belarus near the Lithuanian border. And they had one daughter and 5 sons. The daughter never had any children. The 5 sons really represent the 5 branches of the Hendel family. It was the middle son. His name was Pfeiffer Zelig, and he then became Philip Jacob when he came to the United States. And he was the first one to decide to leave, basically to escape the persecution, which was really rampant in Russia those days, and to seek economic opportunity in the United States. So Pfeiffer Zelig came to the United States in 1891, and he was met in New York by some relatives from his mother's side, the Engelsons. First of all, they changed his first name from Pfeiffer Zelig to Philip Jacob, and they said his last name, Hendel, that was not a proper American name, it was really too Jewish. And they wanted him to have a proper American name, so from Hendel they changed it to Goldberg. In 1896, the first Handel, although he was Goldberg, came to New London. Morris is my grandfather, and at the time they got those papers, he was in the Lithuanian army. His other brother, who wasn't about to leave, was pretty good at false papers, and managed to get a passport for him with his picture on it, but it wasn't really his passport. And they were also able to get civilian clothes smuggled to him on the troop transport that he was in. So my grandfather entered the train as a soldier, went into the men's bathroom. In the men's bathroom was his civilian clothes stashed in the bathroom, went in, changed into civilian clothes, left the bathroom as civilian, and met his two relatives. They got on a boat in Hamburg and came to the United States in January 1922.
When I came here, people literally bragged about the fact that for the Jewish High Holy Days, all of downtown New London closed. And it was impressive. And the Jews kind of thought that it was a sign of respect. And it might have been a sign of respect. But I also think it might have simply been an economic decision, because so many of these stores in downtown New London were run by Jews who would close them for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So the other merchants said, nobody's going to come downtown, so why should we stay open?
If you went up and down the street, most of the retailers were Jewish, and they were, to my knowledge, they were successful. Graders and the Style Shop and Tani's and Malov's and brands. They just all did it.
Malov Jewelers, Perry Jewelers, Tarney's, which was a men's clothing store, Gruskin Hardware, that was owned by Jewish people, and then Saltz's kosher meat market.
My grandfather settled in New London in 1898, lived on the corner of Main and Federal Street. He had a little store there. He was handy with his hands and could fix broken furniture. He would do that and then resell it, and that became the beginning of a Schaffner's furniture store.
Prior to redevelopment, it was John and Parter Streets. You can go down John Street was the kosher market, Salt's Kosher Meat Market, and then around the corner on Potter Street was Salt's Meat Market, which was for the general public, non-kosher meats. It was a decent size. It had a freezer and it had the chopping blocks, and they had a whole area where people could look into the freezers and see what kind of meats were there for the day. But it was very, very friendly. The Jewish population would go there to get kosher salami, kosher bologna, chickens, meats, especially specialty meats for the holidays that stay up till all hours of the night, so that they could take care of their customers for the next day for the holiday, whether it had been for Passover or for the New Year. I remember the rabbi would always come into the shop and make sure everything was kosher and to the T. The slaughterhouse was annexed to the meat market, so they might bring in cattle, definitely a lot of chickens, lamb. Occasionally you'd have hunters that would come in and ask my uncle if he wouldn't mind slaughtering a deer that might have been killed, in the wild. And also, a portion of the slaughterhouse, they'd bring in a rabbi known as the shechitz, who would take care of the chickens that have to be slaughtered in a certain way. Cows would have to be slaughtered in a certain way so that it was all done biblically correct. The other market was like a show place. People would come in and tell my Uncle Lester, my father, or my Uncle Alvin what they liked, and they had some other people that worked there too. They might have had 1 or 2 extra bushers on the weekends, and they had a big freezer in there where they always stocked their fresh slaughtered cattle, and they'd have the best hot dogs. People loved their hot dogs. I remember they would always come for their hot dogs, and some people would just snap them and eat them raw there. My Uncle Alvin was a very, very generous man who had a great heart. But if he saw that some of his customers who worked with my uncles and my father had any kind of a financial problem, he would say, "Oh, okay, so you'll pay us next time." And sometimes they didn't even pay next time, and it just went right over his shoulders.
My father's restaurant was called Fern's Restaurant. It was at 68 State Street. My Uncle Max's was called Ye London Grill on the corner of State Street and Main Street, sort of kitty corner from my dad's restaurant. The restaurant, which was my dad's, was open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And help obviously was not easy to come by because everyone could go to work in defense industry or join the service. We as a family, and with some help, ran the restaurant. And even as a young student, I would go to the restaurant, after my school and Hebrew school activities. Now, Navy and Coast Guard personnel in London during that period were there and were big and were many. They would, before joining a bus or getting a bus, would come into my dad's restaurant. My dad also had a liquor license, so there was a 4-seat bar right almost at the front door, and they would wait there for the buses, which would come in and they'd be easily seen. This is, of course, back in the early 40s. My dad also had clientele who were what I call regulars. There were some people who were probably retired or in business but were living near downtown. There were a few that would be there almost every day for dinner. I think my father probably put in minimum of 7 days a week, 12 to 14 hours. And my mother was there probably 6 days, if not 7, at a good 12 hours. It was the way it had to be, as I say. Help was not available.
After New London decided on redevelopment, everything in that whole area was knocked down. So my uncles at that time said, well, what are we going to do? So they had to look for a new place, or places I should say, for their business. And on Goldene Street, there was a vacancy, and they completely renovated the building and put in new showcases. They put in a new freezer, a new refrigerator, so that they'd be able to serve their customers. The kosher market was, I think, an abandoned gas station across the street from the New London main firehouse on Bank Street. And they gutted that building and put in a freezer and a showcase, and came up with the new Solt's kosher meat market. I don't have the pure dates, but they both closed at the same time. The business lasted over 100 years.
In 1898, PJ, as he was known, Philip Jacob, opened his first business, which was called The Output, at 27 Bank Street. It was a men's furnishing store. PJ eventually added women's furnishings to the store. It became so prosperous that PJ, according to his grandson, was the wealthiest Jew in New London. He owned the first telephone in New London. According to his grandson, his wife wasn't so happy about it because being the first telephone in New London, she said, there's nobody to talk to. So that was PJ. His other two brothers, Richard and Julius, came to the United States in 1904. Julius set up a shoe store. And in the back of the shoe store, Richard had a couple of sewing machines, and he started sewing things. And he developed what they called a waist. This waist apparently had garters that young boys could hold up their socks. I guess they didn't have elastic back then. They moved from that place to Howard Street to continued producing. He went from 2 sewing machines to a little factory, and it was called the R&J Waist Company. Julius continued to sell shoes, And eventually he left that place and moved to the Lawrence building on Bank Street, where he was selling shoes called the Eversource Shoe Company. Richard apparently became quite successful in this waste company thing and moved from Howard Street to Coit Street, and from a small factory became a large factory on Coit Street called the R&J Factory. Eventually Julius gave up the shoe factory and moved in with Richard on Coit Street and started manufacturing his own garments. It was called the Hendel Manufacturing Company. My grandfather bought a restaurant down in Bank Street called the Fireman's Lunch. He ended up closing that, had a furniture store for a while, and then opened a toy store called Lee's Kitty Land, which many people remember very fondly. His grandson, my cousin Peter Marcus, still runs Lee's Kitty Land, derivative of that in Groton right now. His cousin William started working at the R&J, lasted one day. The second day, he told in very broken English to his Italian supervisor, "I no work here no more," and left and started working with his cousin Hilbert, selling door-to-door dry goods. First, they started selling it from their little cousin Seymour's baby carriage. They went from a baby carriage eventually to a push cart, and then finally from a push cart they got a truck. And then they got a store on Bank Street where they called the Hendel Furniture Company. And then in addition to furniture, they started selling stoves. From stoves, they decided to sell gas and oil for the stoves. They became one of the largest businesses in southeastern Connecticut, selling oil, propane gas, furniture, and the rest is history.
You know, there were families that did very well in this community and were very much a part of the philanthropy in not just the Jewish community, but the general community.
My father, Perry T. Schaffner, he was quite well known in the community. He ran for the state legislature in Connecticut and was elected in 1944 during World War II. And then he was elected again in 1948 to the state Senate. During those times, he became very familiar with the politicians who were running the state, as well as our representatives and senators in Congress, Governor Ribicoff and Senator Brian McMahon. 1948, in the United Nations, it was coming up for a vote on whether Israel should become a state. My father, as I suppose many others from around the country, went down to Washington. The State Department was against Israel being a state. He had to talk to Senator Brian McMahon that he should go to President Truman and get him to make sure that the United States would vote for Israel becoming a nation. And at the end of World War II, the furniture store that we had on the corner of Main and Federal Street, my father arranged to buy the building that housed an automobile agency just to the left of the county courthouse at the top of State Street. While he was there, I mean, we were there for many years, it had an entryway, and frequently he would take a rocking chair out into this entryway, because many of the people who were coming to the courthouse for legal affairs, they would be going by and they would stop to chat, and he would find out what were their problems. Some of them had relatives in Europe that had immigration problems, so he would go to bat for them.
I was born in '39, so I'm growing up, it's the Second World War. And one of the things that I remember very vividly is my father was the chairman of the scrap drive. Now, he was involved in politics eventually. I don't know quite how he got pulled into it. He became a city councilor. He eventually became the mayor. As a matter of fact, he was mayor of New London 3 times.
Harvey Malov was a tremendous guy, very active in politics. My second night in New London was election night, and I was at Harvey and Ross Mallow's house for dinner. They invited me for dinner for election night, and then Harvey was on the phone all night congratulating or consoling politicians that he knew. He was very close with Chris Dodd, and he was very involved in politics, both Democrat and Republican.
A number of Hendels have served in a variety of public service. I myself have served on the Board of Education here. I served as president. I served on the New London City Council as deputy mayor. Another cousin, Philip, served as deputy mayor as well. Cousin Pat Hendel served as state representative.
Probably when I was already a young mother and I had moved back here from California, my mother had gotten involved with Williams Park, and she was always having these meetings, which I really didn't know what she was doing. Every time I drove by the park, it looked better. And I noticed that they were having benches. They were selling benches, and there were people's names on them, and people had been donating benches, and they were cleaning up garbage, and they were always doing a fundraiser. And we did many fundraisers. We did music in the park. We had free cleanup from the Coast Guard Academy. Those guys would come over, men and women, and help clean up the leaves and beautify it. My mother raised a lot of money with a lot of different organizations. She wrote a lot of grants for money, and that went towards the brand new garbage cans, the statues, the war memorial. There's another memorial for Jewish veterans there.
Plantings.
Yeah, plantings, trees, and it wasn't just Williams. It was Williams and various other parks too around it was the park next to Bethel. They planted the trees that are straight across the land there. They went to the other Williams Park, by the way. There is another Williams Park around the corner from that Williams Park. It's smaller, and they did some beautification, and they also did a Riverside Park. They put a lot of energy into it. But the love was Williams Park because my mother loves gardening. How much do you love gardening?
I still do.
And now when you drive past there, you can feel really proud of it. There's a bench with my parents' name on it that was donated in honor of all the work that they both had done in the park.
The Jewish community had grown gradually here with immigrants that came mostly from Eastern Europe. So one would settle in the area and someone else would be coming and they would find them, and gradually it grew. One of those streets, I don't think it's there anymore, Shapley Street, they established a little synagogue there, and it lasted for a while until it burned down, and my grandfather and one of his sons ran in and saved the Torahs, the biblical writings that each synagogue generally has. After that, they still needed a place to pray, and so going down Main Street towards State Street, Jake Solomon had a stationery store, and above it there was some space, so they used that as a temporary prayer hall. Eventually on Federal Street, they bought a church. They made all the adjustments necessary, and it became a large synagogue. I had my bar mitzvah there, and even a couple of my children, I think, eventually did.
The synagogue that was on Federal Street, Ahavat Chesed, of course, moved to Montauk Avenue. I think that had to do with the redevelopment of downtown, and they were sort of relocated there on Montauk, where they still are to this day.
And to give you an idea of the intimacy of the Jewish community with the general New London community, when that synagogue moved from downtown New London, the heart of New London, out to Montauk Avenue, it wasn't just rabbis, but it was ministers and priests. They all literally had a parade of the Torahs down Montauk Avenue to move them into the new building. And the earliest congregations, there was one on Blindman Street, And the Blindman Street Shul became the Centro de la Comunidad building. One of them was the original Bethel and is now Trinity Missionary Baptist Church.
When my folks came to New London, which had to have been at the, in the latter 30s, I don't know which shul they went to begin with, but basically they were Orthodox Jews. And Orthodox in this nation is the most strict on the religions, of the religious sects of the Jewish community. And I don't know just where, but they became conservative Jews in practice, which means that you don't follow all the rules as strictly. The kosher laws and so on, the ways of living and what you did. When I was 5 years old, we were going to Bethel, which was on Blackhall Street then. To my knowledge, my father was one of the founders, if not one of the founders, very early.
As we were growing up, my dad belonged to the Orthodox synagogue on Federal Street, I believe it was. And even as a child, I went to the conservative Temple Bethel. Although, interesting enough, when it came time for my bar mitzvah, and I don't know why, my father had me tutored by Mr. Zamikow, a well-known Orthodox man belonging to the Federal Street Synagogue. And I had a bar mitzvah, which would have been in, say, 43, 44, and it was on a Thursday. I understand you have a bar mitzvah on a Monday, Thursday, or Saturday. Mine was on a Thursday. It was a quick trip from the restaurant to the synagogue, where there were on a Thursday some regular elderly people around. So we had enough for a quick bar mitzvah. And as I recall, that was it. We went back to the restaurant.
I guess the war had just ended, and we had this big guy come into Hebrew school, which, is an after school thing. Okay, we had this big guy come into Hebrew school and put in our class. Now, so this is 1946, so I'm 6 or 7. And this guy comes into our class, and he speaks, with such a accent he speaks, it's even worse than that. Hard to understand him. He didn't have a huge English vocabulary, but he was eager, and in those days they taught us Hebrew. That's gone away. They teach you how to read Hebrew, but not to use it. So we're learning Hebrew and vocabulary, and this guy knows some of it, but he knows from nothing in English. Found out, we were all like, what is this? He was a camp survivor. And when he came over, I don't know how his family came to this community, but he went to Hebrew school at our level. He was probably a teenager. I still remember that. That was just, always made such an impression. We were pretty well shielded about what went on until after the war. Bethel eventually got to the point, I was just coming up on 13, and they'd grown, and they had grown not only in size, but in wealth and so on. And they decided they needed a new home. So they built the synagogue on Ocean Avenue, which was built to accommodate 400 plus families.
When Bethel moved from where Trinity Missionary Baptist Church is now out to their new building on 660 Ocean Avenue, what happened, and it's really, in a way, sociologically interesting, they hired an architect to build 660 Ocean Avenue, Congregation Bethel, and he built this synagogue in New London and another synagogue in Syracuse, New York, as gigantic cathedral-type buildings. So there were these tall ceilings, and Jews are always supposed to be oriented towards the east, towards Jerusalem when they pray. But this architect, when he built the chapel for the synagogue, did not have the pulpit so that the worshipers faced east. They were facing north.
It made me always a little bit dizzy in there because the walls were built on an angle. They were angled out, so it always looked like they were going to fall. I had a new appreciation of the difficulty of designing a building that was supposed to be, obviously something of a showpiece or, very impractical in many ways, but visually or architecturally stunning, with those walls going out and that odd shape for the ceiling. The other thing about it, of course, was that it had a extremely high ceiling. I mean, it was supposed to stick up high into the air, which was a great visual to see a synagogue as, almost like a church steeple in that way. So I say it was visually very striking, and it still is. I mean, if you go by it. Also, the ark itself was a very unusual ark. When I first walked into the place, it immediately reminded me of my favorite serial program, which was Star Trek, because it had these clear plastic cylinders, 6 of them, that held the Torah scrolls. And you looked in there and you said, what type of an ark is this? I've never seen anything like this. It looks like something from the future. It is interesting that the core, really the religious core of Bethel, was in very many ways brought to the synagogue by a synagogue that existed downtown called Ohev Shalom. But Bethel made a very important decision early on when Ohev Shalom was diminishing and couldn't keep up their building. They were a more Orthodox synagogue, and they were deciding whether to join Bethel, which was conservative, or Ahavat Chesed, which was Orthodox, which suited them, religiously probably better. But they had a demand, and the demand was that any members of their synagogue, Ohev Shalom, that were dues-paying members, their dues would stay exactly what they are at Ohev Shalom, and they would never go up. Bethel had the wisdom really to say these people would be a great addition. It's not so many people, and they're older people. Why not? And those people became the people who kept the morning minyan going. They were the heart of the Shabbat morning services. They were the most loyal, dedicated, wonderful people that you can imagine. Not to mention all the other things that they brought over from that synagogue. The pews they brought over for the chapel, a whole bunch of Torah scrolls over, and other things. It was wonderful. And I think for all of those years, Bethel was thankful that they made that decision. In New London, at the synagogue actually, there was a pretty healthy day school for our kids to go to. And all of our kids went to the Solomon Schechter School, which was housed in the building. When we started it at Bethel, there were, I think, 18 kids in the school. Just to give you an idea of the dynamics of the community, it grew to a high point of about over 90 kids in the school. It was a combination of people moving into the community, Jewish people, the school getting more recognition, and also a fairly healthy injection of new Russian immigrants who pretty much under the auspices of the Federation were moving into the community. So in the 90s, I would say probably 90s and early 2000s, got up 80 or 90 students in the school. And then it began to get smaller after that.
And we were doing all right until Pfizer moved much of its research out. And with that, they took a lot of very highly paid Jewish scientists. And that's when we could no longer afford the building. It took us a number of years to admit it and to finally sell it, but that's what happened with that.
Do you remember the first time that you and Jean were talking about a synagogue?
Her son, Dick,
Right.
was her oldest child, and they were starting to think about his bar mitzvah. They were not religious people, but they had a feeling of being part of the world of Judaism. They didn't really have any knowledge other than what their families gave them about their religion.
So they weren't raised Orthodox.
No, the girls were not.
So Jean didn't feel like she would fit in at Bethel?
They wanted something different and more liberal. And they wanted a clean slate.
Got it.
They wanted the ability to do what they wanted, and then they wanted the temple to satisfy the yearning for belonging to something that was, I'll use the word Hamish, felt like home. We started out with 5 families, of which I was one of them.
We didn't have a temple for many years, so the Unitarian Church in New London said, you can use our space.
And we rented a building.
We bought it. It was the Bishop Seabury Church
Yeah,
in, on Thames Street at the bottom of the fort. And later, they sold that building and built Temple Emmanuel in Waterford. So that's where it is now.
Where we are photographing now, this is Temple Israel. Temple Israel is just celebrating its 100th anniversary. So it was built in 1924, 6 years before I was born. And the reason that it was built, in those days, we didn't have air conditioning. And people who lived inland, Hartford and in Springfield, Massachusetts, they needed to get away. The summers were terrific there in terms of the heat. And they would come down here to the Ocean Beach area. Some bought houses, some rented rooms down here. And eventually there was a kosher hotel built 1 block down from here. It's an empty lot now. And so people were able to come to the hotel. Well, now with this group of Jews coming in the summertime, they needed some place to pray. And so they built this synagogue in scale. It's sort of an intimate scale, but it provided a place for them to pray.
After being here, probably like 4 or 5 years in, one Friday night, we had the gates closed, and more so our dog wouldn't get out, and we hear people screaming and yelling. I said, "What the hell is that?" We walk out, and it was a couple of members of the synagogue from the Park Street Temple Israel. They needed a minyan, the quorum of 10 men, to come and make Friday night and welcome the Shabbat and Sabbath and services.
They came to our house, they hit the jackpot.
Yeah.
Because it just so happened that all our kids were here, so they had Larry, my 2 son-in-laws, and my son. So we certainly, made that quorum. It was really nice. And even now, when they come and they need someone on a Friday, if they're here, they'll go with Larry.
Sadly, the large Jewish community, which was Bethel, the conservative congregation, moved. They closed, they sold their building, and they're no longer in New London, although their office is still in New London. The Orthodox congregation of Chesed is still on Montauk Avenue, but it's struggling to stay open, struggling very hard. And I would say that the Reform Jewish community, which in a way you could say broke away from the conservative congregation, originally was in Groton, actually in a building that the mosque is in now, and then they moved to Waterford. So our ties to New London as an organized Jewish community have really diminished. So the intimacy is no longer automatic, whereas it was really automatic before. I mean, the Jewish immigrant community, the Italian immigrant community, the African American community, the Polish community, they were all small ethnic communities living cheek by jowl in the heart of New London. And it was really a special place. And then, then there was the Neptune Park Jews. There were Jews that came down from Hartford and Springfield, and they were generally wealthy Jews who could afford to buy a place and have a summer home. We could go back even earlier. I mean, you know that the 1938 hurricane wiped out the city. They also wiped out a little neighborhood that was literally where Ocean Beach is now. Used to be homes, and a lot of those homes were Jewish homes.
New London had an interesting development during my time. The old Ocean Beach was only half as deep. Where the boardwalk is now, that was the main road going into Ocean Beach. And as you drove in, you got the beautiful smell of Izzy's Delicatessen and of course popcorn. I was 8 years old in 3rd grade, and when we had no notice of the hurricane coming, and around 10 o'clock in the morning we saw that outside the windows of the school the trees were going up and back. It was my Bartlett school, and they told us to go home. So we went out to go home. We had so many tall elm trees in New London, and many of them were down. To go home, you had to climb over all these trees to get there. What had wiped out Ocean Beach, it was like a tremendous wave, wind-driven wave that came up the river, and it hit Bank Street, which sticks out into the river, and fire broke out. So we had fire and flooding, and there were boats that were up on the land. It was an amazing thing.
And when we took our kids to Ocean Beach when they were growing up, you could dig in the sand and you would occasionally actually literally hit the asphalt of a road that went down Ocean Beach. I mean, they tore down that whole neighborhood and turned it into Ocean Beach, which was wonderful.
I was 6 or 7 years old. Coming from a small town, I'd never seen the ocean before. So I remember coming down Ocean Avenue, and when you hit right around where we are now, this end of Ocean Avenue, you saw the ocean, and I was amazed by it. But the sight of the ocean was just, I marveled at it, like I still do. I guess it probably was the first time I went to Ocean Beach. And I remember going through the toll gates at the parking lot, and you got a ticket, and you went in, and the parking lot was immense. It was huge. The smells. If I remember right, there was cotton candy, there was popcorn, hamburgers, all that kind of stuff. And the first thing you ran into was the GAM. And the GAM is where all the games were. Pinball machines, and not the electronic pinball machines you get now, but the ones that were really out with the bells and the whistles and everything else. And the tilts, of course. If you push a machine too hard, you get a tilt on it. And the skee ball machines, which are still there now with the same balls and everything else. And again, there was that character that was just unbelievable. And my grandmother had a ritual, so she and the other two would go down to the water. And this is the way they thought of swimming. And she would look at the water, and she'd take her hands and she'd go, "Ay, I'm a chaya," like that. And the other two would do the same thing. Then they walk back to the beach and the bike, and that was it. That was the way. That was the way in the water. Machaya, I guess in Yiddish, is a translation roughly for me being a blessing.
When I was going to Mitchell, my father would come up to New London, and he would take me to the Lighthouse Inn for dinner. And I just remember how elegant it was, and the white tablecloths, and the wonderful service, the china, the crystal, and just everyone, the diners. It was a very quiet atmosphere.
And then where Ballard Academy was, Admiral Drive, the developers built Admiral Drive, and originally it was restricted. They weren't selling to Jews. And then they weren't selling enough houses, so they said, we better sell to Jews. So they ended up selling to Jews, and Admiral Drive eventually became a Jewish neighborhood. And the beaches along Pequot Avenue had signs. No Negroes, no Jews. Literally posted on the beach. And that got taken care of too.
We moved over to the big house on Glenwood Avenue. We were there probably dazed, for all I know. And a woman came knocking at the back door. It's important, the back door, which is a very informal approach for somebody who's of class. And it's a woman who introduces herself as Mrs. Rogers. She lives a block and a half away from us. Great, big, gorgeous Georgian colonial on the waterfront. Owns a whole chunk of the waterfront, and as a matter of fact, there's one beach down there that's named after her family, Rogers Beach. And she introduces herself to my mother, wants to meet her, new neighbor, which is a nice thing. But it turns out she specifically has come over to apologize. Mother doesn't even know her. To apologize for the fact that although the beach at the foot of our street is named for her family, they don't control it. It was leased a number of years before to an organization which calls itself the Rogers Beach Club. And it's restricted. No Jews. I don't know what other restrictions they have. I do know no Jews. And she was absolutely upset about it. They had tried over the years to break that lease and could not do it. But because their house fronts on the water on Pequot Avenue, they have their own stretch of beach right in front of the house. Would we please use it as if it were ours? So my sister, who is at that point 10, and I'm 4, and we had use of that beach with there was a restriction. We had to be home by a certain time.
If you didn't know New London, you would say, oh, what a nice big beach. But what it was chopped up into maybe 6 or 7 privately owned beaches. And the 2 on the end were what I had heard as a child did not allow Jewish people to join. The ones in the middle, the Saccarelli, which I believe is the guy that owned Saccarelli's from Greenway. Is that the same person?
I think so.
Yes. So that's how my parents got interested in Saccarelli's. And when we went to Saccarelli's beach when I was little, we were there until Mrs. Saccarelli died. And she was a large Italian woman who sat in a beach chair with a bucket, and if you brought a friend, you had to pay a nickel or a quarter, I don't remember. And there was like a little house that she kept your chairs in, and she would set your chairs up for you.
Help you with your,
with your baby. She would help
with
you.
the baby
Yeah.
and setting up. She would put the umbrella up for
Oh
me.
yeah, she would do that.
And she would hold the baby and get me settled. She was really a lovely woman.
It was a place of freedom and laughter. It was, my mother and her friends had their circle, their group, and then there might be another group of women over here, and another group of women over here, but everybody, every mother was watching every child. So it was like nobody drowned. Like we all made it through. And one of my mother's friends taught me how to swim on that beach, Mrs. Weissman, Elaine Weissman.
Yeah.
She taught me how to swim. She taught us all how to swim. When Mrs. Saccarelli passed away, my parents joined Guthrie Beach. To the left of the gate, if you're facing the water, where all the Jewish people sat. And to the right of the gate were the people who weren't Jewish. And if you really were really, really, really Jewish, you sat as far to the left as you could get.
When the kids got older, we would take a trip to New London, to Ocean Beach. We started approaching retirement age. We were thinking, where are we going to move? And our thought was always Cape Cod. We were up in the Boston area visiting my son, and we were driving back, and I said, wait, forget about Cape Cod. We're here in New London, that's halfway in between our son and my daughters. One is in Stamford and one was in New York. I said, this is a perfect place. And when we first moved in, the rabbi, she was walking by from Temple Bethel, and she came over and she greeted us. And we were so happy that we were going to be right down the street from the temple. We were going to go to the holidays there. It was just a wonderful feeling. But unfortunately, they closed. But we decided, you know, we love the community. There's still, you know, many Jewish families, but everyone we meet is just so warm and welcoming. And it's a wonderful community to be in. And we decided, you know what, we're going to stay right here.